Good afternoon. Hope you're enjoying the conference. Welcome to Dynamic Database Credentials, a secure and efficient approach. My name is Harvey Cary. I'm a lead member of technical staff at AT&T in the Chief Security Office. I've been in cybersecurity most of my career and primarily focused around secure software development, data security, and secure architecture. My goal of this talk is to encourage everyone to think about how you're currently protecting your data assets, your databases, the data contained within. Are you already using dynamic accounts? Are you using static accounts, right? Which is kind of the norm. That's what we've been doing for years. But we need to look at what can we do better to reduce our risk. And every static account is an opportunity for compromise, right? So we want to limit the number of accounts we have in our database. So, in this day and age, I think data is one of the most valuable commodities we have. And, I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that statement. A lot of effort goes into trying to get data, right? To get people's personal data. There's laws and regulations around protecting that data. And there can be pretty significant fines if you're not protecting that data properly. So we really need to try to step up our game. And we're also moving to the cloud at the same time. And so a lot of our networks are in hybrid mode, right? We're running some of our workloads inside in our private network, some of our workloads in public cloud. And, times we need to communicate with databases that are from one to the other. And, even if you're not in public cloud and you think, well, we just have our private network and we're good to go. If that network is connected to the internet, right, there's a risk there. If you have partners that connect into your network, right? So if you have like a VPN between you and a partner, you don't necessarily know their security practices, right? Hopefully you do, but you may not. And you may not know that their security practices aren't to your standards, right? So you have to consider that a potential vector of compromise. So you need to start looking at your networks as not being completely safe, right? So 20 years ago, everybody thought, oh, I'm on my private network, it's my LAN, my WAN, it's all good. That really isn't the case today, especially with IoT devices, right? So there's so many IoT devices on our LANs that potentially put us at risk. And if you look at some compromises, at least one compromise I'm sure many of you will recognize, but their HVAC contractor was compromised. And then when they plugged into their network, into their HVAC system, the Trojan or malware spread into their network, right? So that was intentional, right? Stuck next. Drop a USB drive, right? Somebody plugs it in, right? So our networks really are not safe anymore, and we need to treat them that way. And that's where zero trust comes from, right? And this is a step towards, I think, zero trust, at least a piece of it. We're constantly under a state of attack, and in the security industry, it's a lot of pressure, right? You have to be right 100% of the time, and the bad actor only has to be right once, right? Nobody knows about the 20,000 attacks that you were able to successfully stop. They only know about the one you didn't. Our adversaries are using better tools than ever before. They're better funded than ever before, and many of them are state actors, right? And it's very hard to compete against a state actor. If you kind of translate this over to something more tangible, right? And you say, well, you have diamonds, maybe gold, right? And we take that and we lock that up in a safe. And there's a finite number of ways to attack a safe, right? You can perform social engineering and obtain the code for the safe, unlock it, right? Get in, take the stuff, close it back up. That's kind of, and the person who owns the safe may not know that you took stuff out of it yet. And that's kind of how it works with people getting into your network, right? As we'll see in a later part of this, that the dwell time is not in hours that a bad actor is in somebody's network. So once a bad actor compromises network, the dwell time is not in hours, it's in days and weeks. And that's if you're really on top of your security, right? So, our personal data has never been a greater risk. And, I really don't think anybody's going to disagree. And we have to figure out, how can we do better, right? We don't want to be the ones in the news. So we're going to take a look at some of the biggest threats to our data, a couple high profile data breaches, some financial impacts. There are true financial impacts that companies experience from compromise. We're going to look at some enterprise level challenges and then look at how we can improve our security posture. And I have a small demo of one of the tools that we can use. It's not necessarily, like I said, I'm not here to promote any tool. So anything I use or talk about here, it's just a tool that's available. And there's multiple open source tools and cloud tools to support this capability. So some eye-opening stats and impacts. A total of 108.9 million accounts were breached in the third quarter of 2022. That's a 70% increase compared to the previous quarter. That is a lot of accounts. And some of them, there were some really big breaches, right? Which is how we got 108 million, almost 109 million in a single quarter. The top 5 countries and regions most affected by data breaches in Q3 of 2022 were Russia, France, Indonesia, US, and Spain. Now, US has always been at the top, right? So currently, Russia leads in terms of data breaches in each quarter of 2022. Throughout the last 10 years, the United States remained the single most breached country. And I think we all recognize that. We know that's the case. The situation only shifted at the start of 2022 after Russia attacked Ukraine. And then the attack on Russian accounts rose by 36% month over month, which is quite an increase. All right, so some of the biggest threats to data that we face are, lack of network-based security controls, right? As we'll see on a upcoming slide, a couple of the high-profile compromises were just simple controls that weren't put in place, right? Direct database access from remote applications, right? So for example, in public cloud, the default behavior is to connect to your database through public interface. That is certainly not something we do, but and the organizations treat everything on their internal network as secure and have little to no network isolations, right? So that's why I was saying, kind of in the opening, that we can't treat our networks like they're completely secure anymore. There's just too much risk involved. Credential management, weak password management and authentication schemes. And this is really where I think some of these tools can help us out. And they're in the fact that we can, one, not have these accounts sitting out there all the time, but also we can ensure certain password complexity. We can ensure no reuse. In the Azure example, I'm going to walk through. You actually get a token. It's a one-time token. Well, not a one-time token. It's a token that's good for a set number of hours. The default is 1. So, some of the biggest threats. Sorry. All right. So privilege threats, right? So, we all know about using least privilege or applying to that, right? So, if a user accidentally misuses access rights that were granted properly, I've had DBAs accidentally drop a table. That's never a good thing. When privileges associated with an account are used inappropriately or fraudulently, maliciously or accidentally, or when you give somebody access levels that they shouldn't have because you're not adhering to least privilege. And that happens generally when you're trying to give people access, and they keep coming back to you saying, oh, I still can't do what I need to do. You're messing up my job, right? And then you just say, okay, fine, I'll give you select asterisk on, you all tables. And then next thing you know, right, they're pulling data out they shouldn't be, or you give them access to drop accidentally, and they end up dropping a table. System threats, and we're really not going to touch too much on this, but unpatched systems, including the underlying OS. This is just in here for completeness, and SQL injection and other types of vulnerabilities. So you need to make sure that your web interfaces to your databases are doing sanity checking and validating the data, right? I mean, it's pretty easy if in this day, if you are susceptible to the OWASP top 10, then you really, really need to rethink your program. Right? Nobody should ever be able to type in quote equals or 1 = 1 and successfully retrieve back some data out of your database. Some notable recent breaches: Cash App. Number of individuals impacted was 8.2 million. So in this case, a former employee had downloaded the Cash App reports with customer information, including names, account, and numbers. This occurred without permission after they no longer worked there, right? So they forgot to go back and remove the user's access, and this was in public cloud, which is why they were able to get to it. Had it been on a private network, unless they had VPN, right, they wouldn't be able to get to it. So it's really important to make sure your processes are there to remove account access. BeetleEye, there were 7 million impacted users, and it was misconfigured AWS 3 bucket, right? And there have been a lot of misconfigured AWS S3 buckets, and that is not a slight on AWS. It is not their fault. The tools are there, the security's there. The one problem with public cloud is that by default, it makes it open. And the problem is, if they make it secure by default, the less knowledgeable users are not going to be able to access their stuff, and then it's going to generate huge amounts of support tickets and phone calls. So in order to avoid that, because that would impact their bottom line, right, they make things a little too open. So I guess in that aspect, maybe a little bit on them, but they have recently gone through and started locking things down automatically on people in the S3 buckets, because they're getting a little frustrated with this bad press. Some financial impacts. So impacts to consumers. There were almost 6 million total fraud and identity theft reports in 2021 at a cost of almost $6 billion to Americans. Impact on companies that experience a breach, right? So I'd said that there's a financial impact, a real financial impact to companies that experience a breach. Share prices fell 3.5% on average, approximately 110 market days following the breach. After 1 year, the share price fell on average 8.6%, which, depending on the size of your company, that's a huge amount. And really doesn't matter the size, right? A smaller company, 8.6% means as much to them as hundreds of millions of dollars to some large companies. There can also be legal issues, as we saw. There's a class action suit and possibly criminal charges, civil penalties. So some enterprise level challenges. Enterprise networks consist of tens of thousands of endpoints. Many enterprises utilize a multi-platform hybrid cloud model. Many different operating systems, many database types: Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, right? I think certainly if you work in an enterprise environment, you recognize this. Large amounts of data to protect, a portion of which has legal or regulatory compliance. That is certainly something we deal with. In any company has any financial constraints or works in that area, they're going to have requirements, right? I mean, Facebook has requirements about protecting people's data. All right, and sometimes there's audits, and there's always going to be a audit sometime, and you need to be able to validate that you're doing all the right things to try to protect these systems and this data. You can be fined for just not protecting, so you don't even have to have a compromise, But if you don't have the right protections in place, the right documentation, you can be fined for that. And these tools really help, and this methodology really helps to account for these um, regulatory compliance issues, as well as documentation of showing who has access and when they had access, and that you're not leaving that access in place. And another piece, and this is something that I am personally kind of dealing with, is that enterprise needs a way to scan their databases for compliance, right? So you need to know, where do we have PII data, where do we have PCI data? All right. So how can we do better? So as an industry, we need to move away from the days of having static, isolated database credentials and authentication. Those accounts end up sitting out there way too long. All right. So, we need to start transitioning to an account-free database model, right? Now, we all know that an account-free database is a database nobody can connect to, right? So there's obviously accounts in there, but we're talking about minimum number of accounts. And I would suggest that you can have 2 accounts, and that's it. One account that would be an emergency break glass DBA account, and an account that's used for your tool that's going to manage your users. Every user after that should be a short-lived user account. Any account or credential in the database should be short-lived, the lifespan in minutes, hours, days. And developers and operation team members no longer need to have access to the database or have accounts in the database constantly. When they need access, they can go request it. And that was actually the catalyst for me moving in this direction. I had DBAs who wanted access to the database, and I didn't really want to give it to them wide open, right? So they wanted it from their workstation sitting on our private network to our database sitting in cloud. And I wasn't comfortable with that because, once I opened that up, then, anybody on the enterprise can start trying to connect to that database. So for a non-public cloud solution, here's what we're looking at. So there's different open source tools out there. In this case, I'm using one called Vault. And the way it works is that you set up your database and you create a DBA account that you use to then configure a connection inside of Vault. And once you do that, you make that connection the first time to the database, and that username and credential. And it makes that connection. And this is why you need that second break glass account, depending on your situation, right? Because you can always get into a database, right? Postgres, you can go in and shut it down, change the HBA config file. So there's always a way to get back, but that would be quite drastic, especially if you're a large enterprise. So once you've created this connection, you actually run a command to rotate that root account. And what that does is that rotates the secret. At that point, nobody knows that secret for that account anymore except for this system. And it's encrypted. And I'm sure somebody from the company that writes it could probably get that password out. But they say there's no way to recover the password. So there may really be no way to recover that password. So that's the reason for having a second break glass account. So once that's in place, so that this account here, right? This is the account that's used for provisioning other users. So for example, if our DBA, well, actually this example is for analysis tool, data analysis. So for a scanner. So the scanner would connect and request credentials, and it would have a user and secret that it would do that with. And once it makes that request and it's validated, potentially, this system could be connected to, ideally, your authentication system. So AD, AAD, right? That way you don't have to manage multiple users. So once that's created, then it will, and you're validated, it will connect to the database the target, create an account, and then return the account name and the secret back to the tool. The tool will then connect directly to the database. And once it's done doing its scan, so when the account was created, it'd be created with a certain duration, 6 hours, 12 hours, right, 1 hour, whatever makes sense, depending on what the scan is. At the end of that time, it would automatically, the system would log in and it would revoke those credentials. So now the account for the scanner is only in there as long as it needs to be. And we could do the same thing for our DBA users. All right, they can be that data analysis tool. They can run either through the UI or preferably through the API. Request an account, it'll return it, and we'll see that. I'm going to give a demo of this. It'll return the account to use, the password, and then they could log in. And we could make that a credential good for 10 hours, right? So they come in Monday morning, they go, hey, give me creds. They log into the database with them. They go home. Shortly after that, the credentials are deleted from the account. They come in Tuesday, don't need access to the database. They don't bother. There's no account in the database for them. All right, so this is how we can reduce the number of accounts in our database. So, the benefits is overall improved security of the infrastructure since each database only has, 1 or 2 accounts in it. The credentials for the account are rotated on a predefined cadence. So when I said that, we create that admin account and then we immediately change its secret, we can set that up to change as often as we want. So we can have that secret change once a day, once a week, once a month, every hour, right? Every hour probably be a little crazy, but whatever frequency we want, right? We can control that. So for some databases, it may be a day. Other databases, it might be once a quarter, right? Every 3 months on the first, change the database, the root credential. That's very hard to do manually, right? But in this case, as it changes, since the vault system is the one connecting, it always knows the password. So you can change it as often as you want. All the other passwords are dynamic, right? So, and the platform will create an opportunity to expand the solution to additional tools, right? So in this case, if we had 3 different data analysis, scanners, maybe one for PCI, one that's looking for credit card data or something, right? Whatever the case may be, or other users, all you have to do is potentially add them to a group. If your system is like authenticating to Azure AD or to your AD or AAD, you could potentially just add the user, the account to a group, and they would automatically have this access. So you wouldn't have to provision them. And that is where moving to this saves you money and time while increasing your security, right? Because I make this connection once for admin, for an administrative connection. After that, it doesn't matter how many people I have. I should be able to, as long as my system is authenticating to my standard authentication system, there's really no administration other than add them to a group. All right, so let's take a quick look at how this works. All right, so things are a little messy here, but I meant to have it cleared. So if I clear this, and so if we look in this database right now, we'll see that there's just a couple users. So there's one for me, there's the Postgres one, there's a read-only role, and then the Vault admin. So this Vault admin is the one that is currently used to authenticate, to create the user, and I have no idea what that password is. I've already rolled it. So, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out, right? So I'm going to log in here. Is that user? Actually, I think I have this set up at the moment because it's local to Just Trust, but right. Oops, one sec. All right. Sorry, test R1. All right. So if we look at the users, that's it. So now I'm going to come up here and I'm going to tell it to make a call to Vault API database cred read only. And what that's going to do is that's going to request an account get created for me in this database, and it will be part of the read only role. So I hit enter. So I get this back. So this is my username. This is my password. At the moment, the lease duration is 1 minute, and it's also renewable. So I can come in and say, you know what, renew that lease, right? If I come down here and hit DU, we're going to see here's the new user that was created, right? And that matches the username it gave me up here. And we can see that it's only valid till 1733.00. So if we do a select now, we're at 1732 and 30. So we got about 30 seconds left. And this account will automatically be removed. And this is the advantage of, keeping the minimal amount of accounts in your database at any given time. I don't think I can go less than a minute. So, all right, we got about 10 seconds left. Okay, it's gone, right? So if we do a select DU, we see it's passed. It's 1733. It was good till 1733, and now the user's gone, right? So with one simple command, your DBAs can do this, and your application would do this. And there's an HTTPS API that you can call, but this one's a little bit easier for demo purposes, right? All right. So, that's a model you can use really in public cloud or in your private network as well, right? That was an open source tool I used to do that. And if you just go out and do a search for dynamic database, you'll find a couple tools that are open source that you can look at using. Now, there's a Azure Active Directory solution. And so I'm going to kind of run through that. I don't have a demo of that just because of some of the changes they're making in time. If you're not aware, Microsoft has announced that they're moving MySQL single server and Postgres single server to retirement mode. MySQL, you can't create a new MySQL single server. So, and some of the changes they've made, I just didn't have a chance to get Postgres one up and working for this, but there's really good documentation on the Azure site for this. So if you're in Azure, and there's similar capabilities in AWS, you can set up your database to use Azure Active Directory for authentication with whatever your database is. So it works with single server, which I don't suggest anybody use anymore, especially if you're moving to it. That would not be a good thing. You need to go to the flexible server. The one problem, at least for us, is that currently, the reason I'll have a demo for this, Postgres flexible server currently does not support private link connectivity. So it would have been really hard to do a demo of this. I would have had to build a second VM just to show the commands. So the way this works is that we have a next, all right, and then there's other database. So the way it works is you create an AAD group, and say you create one called, for your application. So if you had an application called widgets, you might create a group called widgets dash DBAs. You create a role in Postgres or MySQL. They work the same. All the databases work the same. So you create a role in the database that matches that name. So if I created widgets dash DBA in my Active Directory or my Azure Active Directory, I would create a role in the database called widgets-dba. And then, you turn on the Azure Active Directory, which is, if you're doing it in UI, it's clearly marked as you're building it on the screen. It says, do you want to turn on Active Directory? You can do internal authentication only, internal and Active Directory, or Active Directory only. I would probably, at least if you're starting out of the gate, I would probably start with doing both, supporting both Active Directory and local. And especially if you want to kind of compare and contrast using this solution with a open source solution. So you add users to that AAD group, and this is really one of the nice pieces of this. And I kind of talked about with our open source solution, right? Our open source solution, we actually have a commercial solution that we connect to our AAD, and we use that in the same way, right? So like I said, we create a group, we had people users to the group. And you do the same thing here. So it's very similar. And the way it'll work is that, your computer, your user, your application will authenticate to Azure Active Directory. And, you may or may not be aware, but you can take a VM and assign a managed ID to it or a service principal. My suggestion is to go managed ID, just because a service principal, you have to manage the secret, and who wants to do that? With a managed ID, everything's handled for you in the background. And in this case, it'll work because you don't need to know the password. So you have to kind of use a service principal if you want to connect to something, and you need to know the password in order to accomplish that. So what happens is, you from your computer or a VM, right, that could be associated with a managed account, authenticates to Azure Active Directory, and then it runs the command. If you're running this on your system, AZ account get access token, and then when you go to log into the database, you log in as that role I said to create, and the group, right, which is widgets dash DBA. So your user is widgets dash DBA, and in Postgres specifically, there's no such thing as user anymore. Everything's a role, which are still users. So you connect with that user account, and you use the token that was given to you from Microsoft. I don't think I have an example of the token in here, but it's really, really long. So if you need to use this with like the PSQL command, you have to set the PG_data, because the token you get back is like more than 256 characters. It's too long to put on the command line. Even if you paste it in, it'll fail because the PSQL command will not accept a password of that length. So you have to do an export of PG_password and set it to the token. And by default, the token's good for 1 hour. I think they would get up to 24 hours. And I'm not sure if you can set them for longer than that. But the nice thing is that you have this role out there, which, is kind of like a user, but the fact is it isn't. And I could have 30 users in that group, but they all have to authenticate to AD. So I'm not dealing with a mechanism of authenticating to a database versus a mechanism authenticating to my AD or my AAD, right? Everything's authenticating to a single place. And to me, that's where we have to get, right? You really want single sign-on. So since there's no password associated with that role, it's very secure. And you can only get a token that will work with that role if you're in that group. Right. So I think it's a pretty good model. You can do it with applications. Users can use it. With the application, just, if it's set to every hour, every 45 minutes, if you want. I know a couple people doing that. Every 45 minutes, they just go get a new token. I might go 55, but then again, you want a little bit of buffer there, and I don't think you pay for authentication requests. So, this is a model that gives us that capability of having very few or just a couple of accounts in a database, and improves our security and reduces our overhead, right? Because now we're just worrying about our AD users, and we're adding and removing people from groups. And what happens is, unlike, the one company who's in a class action lawsuit because they didn't remove the users' permissions when they left the company, if they're in your AD and your process, and you have a process in place to automatically remove them, from AD, then you automatically remove them from their access to the database. And that right there, to me, is the key to improving your security as well as reducing your overhead. So this is, I think I said in the beginning, to me, this is a case where we can actually say security and doing it better will reduce costs. Obviously, this is a topic that I'm very, passionate about. So hopefully that comes across. So, the benefits of using Active Directory for authentication with ACT, right? So ACT being MySQL, flexible server, Postgres flexible server, Microsoft SQL Server, right? And I think everybody would be able to guess that Microsoft SQL Server used AD or AAD for authentication. Always has. So Azure AD supports MFA. So that works good for, your users. So like your DBAs, And you can use the Microsoft Authenticator, so it's not like you have to go get an RSA token, anything like that. So if you want your DBAs to, and really all your users to use MFA, then your database is automatically going to have MFA for your users, right? And there's really no other really good way I'm aware of, at least. I'm sure there is, but just nothing I've investigated that gives us two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication to a database, right? It's certainly not this easy, because this could just be your corporate policy, and by default you get this, right? And now that wouldn't hold true for the managed identities or the service principals. Again, if at all possible, I recommend staying with managed identities. But that doesn't count, but that's fine, because those are all contained within inside Microsoft, and they have mechanisms to ensure the validity of those accounts. Okay, so as I was just saying, I guess I should have hit the next button, but service principals and managed IDs can obtain a token, which also means no hard-coded passwords. That's a really good point that I did forget. And I kind of said this earlier, actually, is that you don't need to know the password, right? So you create a managed ID. It's part of the reason I think managed ID is better. And actually, I think Microsoft says it's better, right? So it's not like I came up with this. But you don't know the password, right? It's not that you don't have to know it. It's that you don't. It's really hard to get it. You can only get it when you first create it, but you don't need it. And that is a huge advantage, because now I can deploy a system that one can connect to my database, and I have a password nowhere. And if my web server, for example, gets compromised, it's really hard for it to make that connection, right? And it's hard for the individual to figure out how to make a connection and use that account. All right. Customers can manage the database permissions using the AD groups, which I've already said. Advanced identity protections, yeah. So we can use multi-factor authentication, and the database authentication does not use the user's domain credentials to authenticate to the DB. It uses the short-lived token, right? So it's my AD username and password to get the token, but then the token's what's used in the database. So it's a pretty nice system. All right. So the one drawback, depending on your environment and whether you're a hybrid cloud or not, is that this currently only works with Azure AD for Azure, with systems sitting inside of Azure, unless you're using AODS, which I'm not sure if that's actually available to the general public or not. So which is extending the cloud into your data center. All right, so some of the benefits of moving to this model is reduce the number of accounts in the database at any given time, right? So even with the open source solution, you can have as little as 2, right? And if you really, really need to be super secure, you could have 1, and just have the ability that, if something happens and somehow that connection gets severed, that you have a path to recover the database and get the data back out of it, or log in and be able to reset a account, right? So that's really the key to that. It's part of it's risk. We haven't necessarily used this open source tool a lot, so that I would say, hey, I'm comfortable, go ahead, just have 1 account. I'm always of the mindset of, just be extra careful. And you could take that DBA, the break glass account, and you could have it managed by that vault as well, right? So it could create the account, you could set it for 6 months, and then just have it rotate the passwords, right? Or you can just use a script and rotate that 1 password. But even if you have that break glass account, it should be a really ugly password, and it should still be changed at least every 6 months, right? Semi-annually. And just make sure you protect it really well. Short secret rotation time reduces likelihood of compromise. So if we rotate our passwords every 24 hours, if somebody sends a password through email, right, they have a very short window to get in. I had someone accidentally one time paste auth token into, like MS Teams. And yeah, I was like, hey, thanks for doing that. I'm going to go revoke the token now. And so I went and revoked the token. We're good to go. I created a new one and asked them not to do that again. And that's a pretty easy fix. So, if an account is compromised, since the token's being rotated, less time the bad actor has access, right? And there's always the possibility one of the first things they do when they come in is they create another method for them to get back in case you find them and cut their current method or the credential changes. And with less focus on creating accounts by the DBA team, they can spend more time ensuring proper groups and setup configuration, uh, making sure that the database is patched, right? Doing things that are more important that allow the database to perform at its best. All right. So, if there's any questions, contact resources. So, HD Cary 70 on Twitter, and that's my LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions that I don't get to in the Discord channel. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the presentation and you have a good day. Thank you very much.